London's top cop, the police commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley is his name, has said that he needs the unredacted Epstein files. He needs the original evidence that's in the possession of whom? Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice. Brian, it must be really inconvenient for Pam Bondi knowing that there are governments around the world who want to hold criminals in their countries accountable, including people like former princes, former members of parliament, former ambassadors to the United States. And they need the evidence to do it. And that evidence is contained where? In the unredacted Epstein files. When here at home, Pam Bondi will do exactly nothing. She won't lift an attorney general's pinky to hold folk accountable here.
London's top cop just went on record and said it out loud. He needs the files, the unredacted ones, the originals, the evidence sitting inside the United States Department of Justice that could put powerful people, including a former member of the British royal family, in front of a judge. And America is saying no. Not quietly, not with legal justifications, not with procedural delays that at least pretend to follow a process, just no. A flat, deliberate, calculated no from the very law enforcement institution that is supposed to represent justice for the most vulnerable people on earth. So let me ask you the question that nobody in the mainstream press seems to want to touch. If there is nothing to hide, if the powerful men connected to Jeffrey Epstein's network are truly innocent, then why is the United States government working this hard to make sure the world never sees the evidence? Stay with me, because what is happening right now in real time is one of the most consequential cover-ups of the modern era. And the people orchestrating it are not shadowy figures operating in the dark. They are sitting in government buildings in Washington, D.C., in broad daylight with titles and press offices and the full weight of the American legal system behind them. And they are protecting someone. The question is who? To understand what is at stake, you need to understand what these files actually are, not in the abstract, not as a political talking point, but in real, concrete terms. Jeffrey Epstein was not just a wealthy man with powerful friends. He was the architect of a system designed to exploit, to compromise, and to connect. He moved in circles that most people will never even glimpse in their lifetimes. Heads of state, billionaires, royals, academics, intelligence figures, people who shape the world. And over decades, Epstein built a network that was protected not just by money and influence, but by documentation, by files, by evidence, by a paper trail so extensive that when federal investigators finally moved in, they did not find a smoking gun. They found an entire smoking arsenal. 3 million documents. That is what sits inside the possession of the United States Department of Justice right now. 3 million files connected to Jeffrey Epstein's operation. And the American government, under the direction of Attorney General Pam Bondi, has refused to release them, has refused to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a federal law that legally mandates their disclosure, has refused to even lift what one legal expert described as an attorney general's pinky finger to hold anyone accountable. 3 million documents, and the public has seen almost none of them. But here is where this story shifts from outrage to something far more serious. Because it is not just the American public being denied access to this evidence. It is foreign governments, foreign law enforcement agencies, countries with active, ongoing investigations into the crimes committed inside Epstein's network, crimes that did not happen only on American soil, and crimes whose perpetrators do not all carry American passports. And one of those governments has now said, loudly and formally, that they need what Washington is sitting on. Sir Mark Rowley is the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service, London's top cop, a man who does not make public statements like this casually or without consequence. And he went on the record and said, and these are his words, not a paraphrase,
what will. So London law enforcement officials are saying, and don't take my word for it, let me quote what London's top cop has said, quote, "Of course, there's a big body of that evidence, the Epstein evidence, in the United States in all those files. And at some stage, we're going to need the unredacted evidence," Sir Rowley said, quote, "We need the original copy. And where did it come from? And that's going to be necessary if we get to the stage of court case."
Quote, "There is a big body of that evidence, the Epstein evidence in the United States in all those files. And at some stage, we are going to need the unredacted evidence. We need the original copy and where it came from. And that is going to be necessary if we get to the stage of court cases." Court cases. He said court cases. That means he is not theorizing. He is not speculating. He is preparing. The Metropolitan Police are building something, a prosecution, a case file, a legal argument that could bring someone powerful to trial in a British court. And to do that, to finish what they are building, they need what Pam Bondi is holding. Now hold that thought, because before we go any further, you need to understand exactly who the UK is already investigating, because this is not a hypothetical. This is already happening. Former Prince Andrew, a man who was once one of the most prominent members of the British royal family, who was stripped of his royal duties, his military titles, and his HRH styling, who sat down for one of the most catastrophic television interviews in the history of broadcast journalism and attempted to explain his relationship with a convicted sex trafficker to a disbelieving world, who then quietly settled a civil lawsuit brought by Virginia Giuffre, a woman who alleged she was trafficked to him by Epstein for an undisclosed sum of money. You do not settle lawsuits you are confident you will win. That is not how powerful men with powerful lawyers operate. You settle when the alternative is worse, when what might come out in discovery is worse, when the cost of silence is lower than the cost of exposure. Former Prince Andrew has now been arrested in the UK on suspicion of committing crimes.
They're in. And mind you, Brian, they have already arrested former Prince Andrew. They have already arrested on suspicion of committing any number of crimes Peter Mandelson, who was a longtime member of Parliament and was the UK ambassador to the United States. Countries around the world, and this is not just in the UK, are actually investigating the crimes that are contained in the Epstein files, even the minimal batch that Pam Bondi has allowed to be released. And yet here at home, Pam Bondi does nothing but cover it up. So this will be really interesting to see how Pam Bondi responds to the UK saying, we would like to hold our criminal actors accountable.
And the British police are telling Washington, we have a case we are trying to build, and you have the evidence we need to complete it. But here is what makes this entire situation so deeply disturbing. It is not as though Pam Bondi lacks a mechanism for transferring this evidence. It is not as though international law has not anticipated exactly this kind of situation. There are agreements, formal, binding agreements between the United States and allied nations called mutual legal assistance treaties.
Is there anything that would compel Pam Bondi to release any files to foreign governments who are requesting this information, or is it all voluntary?
Yeah, Brian, great question. There are mutual legal assistance agreements that countries strike with one another that allows the sort of facilitation and free exchange of information like this that is in the possession of one country. But for law enforcement reasons, it's important that it be transferred to the possession of another country. Now, I don't believe there is any reporting that those formal mechanisms have been activated, and there has been that kind of a formal request, but you just heard the quote from London's top cop, the police commissioner, and it feels like that may be the next stage if Pam Bondi, deigns not to even bother responding to the top law enforcement officials in London.
MLAs, legal frameworks specifically designed to facilitate the exchange of evidence between countries when crimes cross borders and when law enforcement in one country needs what another country holds. These are not suggestions, they are treaties, signed agreements, legal obligations. And the United Kingdom, one of America's oldest, closest, most historically significant allies, is now looking at those agreements and asking whether the United States is going to honor them, whether Pam Bondi is going to pick up the phone and act like a law enforcement official rather than a political shield. And the lawyers who understand this system best are already telling you the answer. Even with a formal MLA request, even if the UK activates every legal mechanism available to them, there is no automatic penalty, no sanction, no consequence that compels the United States to comply if it simply chooses not to. International agreements depend on good faith, on institutional integrity, on a basic assumption that the parties involved actually want justice to be served.
In the UK, but here's the thing, even with MLA requests, it doesn't mean that there's going to be a sanction or a penalty if the United States decides to violate agreements it has perhaps entered into previously with other countries. Does that sound familiar, given that Donald Trump is now heading up the federal government, the United States government, where he is basically, he's an island unto himself, not really caring at all what he says or does to our allies, how he alienates them, how he disrespects them, how he acts unilaterally, including in the Middle East, where, it is working to the severe detriment of ally nations and, frankly, countries around the globe, given the energy crisis we are now experiencing. Donald Trump doesn't seem to give a rat's ass about cooperatively working on any issue with any countries, including some of our longest standing allies. And given that this development that we're discussing right here has kind of flown under the radar, corporate media hasn't seemed to pay it much mind.
And right now, looking at what is coming out of the Department of Justice under Pam Bondi, good faith is not the phrase that comes to mind. Because here is what Bondi and her colleague Kash Patel did. Back in July of last year, they released a memo, a carefully worded, strategically timed memo stating that there was nothing left to investigate in the Epstein files, that the case was closed, that there was no pending investigation. Think about why that matters. In the American legal system, there is a legitimate, well-established reason for prosecutors to withhold evidence from other parties, including other governments. It is called the pending investigation exception. If an active prosecution is underway, you can argue that releasing evidence prematurely could compromise that prosecution. It is a real legal doctrine. It has been used appropriately and responsibly by serious prosecutors for decades. But if you publicly declare there is no ongoing investigation, if you put it in writing in a memo with your name on it,
and Kash Patel putting out a splashy memo back in July of last year saying, oh, good news, there's nothing to be investigated in the Epstein files. Zero pending investigation. That means they can't now claim the pending investigation exception to other jurisdictions wanting and needing the evidence that Pam Bondi is concealing.
You have just destroyed your own ability to invoke that exception. You cannot simultaneously tell the world the case is closed and then turn around and tell foreign governments you cannot share evidence because the case is still open. Pam Bondi cannot have it both ways. And yet, she is trying. She is withholding evidence while claiming there is nothing to investigate. She is blocking foreign governments while claiming there is no active case. She is sitting on 3 million documents, while the people whose lives were destroyed by Epstein's network are still waiting, still fighting through civil courts, still watching the men who hurt them walk free. And the legal experts watching this unfold are using language that should make every person paying attention deeply uncomfortable. When you possess evidence of a crime, when another law enforcement agency is actively trying to hold the perpetrators accountable, and when you deliberately withhold that evidence to prevent that accountability, you are not just failing to do your job, you are obstructing justice. You are acting as an accessory. You are using the machinery of government to protect the very people that government is supposed to hold accountable.
Real quick, let's try a thought experiment here. So what we know is that the UK has demanded these unredacted files and the original evidence so they can go against their wrongdoers in their countries. And let's assume Pam Bondi says, oh, hell no, we're not releasing them domestically. We're certainly not going to give them to other countries. So we could be made to look bad in the process when they saw the light of day around the world, when we've been trying to conceal the damn stuff here in the US. Let's assume that is the choice she makes. I don't think it's a stretch to believe that may be her answer. Let's talk about what that represents in very real terms. When you have evidence of a crime and some authority is trying to pursue holding the criminal accountable, and yet you withhold that evidence that could assist that other law enforcement agency to hold significant wrongdoers accountable, you know what you're doing in a very real sense? You're covering up, in layman's terms, a crime, but you're also acting as an accessory to the crime.
That is not a political opinion. That is a legal framework, and it applies to attorneys general the same way it applies to everyone else. So why would Pam Bondi do this? Why would the Attorney General of the United States, the nation's top law enforcement official, choose to obstruct a foreign investigation into one of the most documented child sex trafficking networks in modern history? The answer that legal analysts keep returning to is uncomfortable, but it has to be said, because her boss is in those files.
These co-conspirators accountable. And so this is really just, a reflection on what Pam Bondi and by association Donald Trump's priorities are, which is not to seek accountability for the people who were wrapped up in this whole Epstein sex trafficking ring, but in fact to protect them. And that's been her priority since day one, because her boss, the person who she is an appendage of, is implicated in these files. And so her job has always been to protect the co-conspirators, and if that means leave the victims twisting in the wind, she's perfectly content to do that. If that means leaving foreign governments who are actually investigating this stuff twisting in the wind, she's completely content to do that as well. That shows what her...
Donald Trump's name appears in documents connected with Epstein's network. His associations with Epstein are a matter of public record stretching back decades. The relationship between the current president of the United States and the most notorious sex trafficker of the modern era is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented. It is photographed. It is quoted in contemporaneous news reports and court filings. Pam Bondi does not work for justice. She works for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has every reason in the world to ensure that those 3 million documents never see the light of day. This is the architecture of a cover-up, not the old-fashioned kind where files disappear in the night, the modern kind where the cover-up is conducted in the open, dressed in the language of procedure and legal process, executed by officials who know that most people will not read past the headline. But some people are reading past the headline. Because beyond Prince Andrew, beyond the American political dimension, there is another name that has quietly surfaced in the British investigation: Peter Mandelson, a man who served for years as a member of Parliament, who was the United Kingdom's ambassador to the United States, one of the most connected political figures in British history, a man who has shaped governments and influenced policy at the highest levels. He has also been arrested in the UK in connection with this investigation. Think about that. A former royal, a former ambassador, both arrested, both under active investigation by British law enforcement, both connected at various points and in various degrees to the network that Jeffrey Epstein built. And the evidence that could either exonerate them or seal their fate, 3 million documents, is sitting in a building in Washington, D.C., in the possession of a woman who says the case is closed. The case is not closed. The victims know it. The British police know it. The lawyers who have spent years fighting for accountability in civil courts know it. And somewhere in the corridors of the Metropolitan Police, investigators are building files and waiting for the moment when the political calculation in Washington shifts enough to force a response. But here is what is not waiting. The women who were trafficked, the survivors who gave testimony, who signed affidavits, who sat across from lawyers and described in detail what was done to them and by whom. They are not waiting in comfortable circumstances. They are not protected by privilege or shielded by institutional power. They are living with what happened to them every day, while the men they named settle lawsuits and retreat behind palace walls and royal lawyers and the silence that money buys. Virginia Giuffre named Prince Andrew. She described in detail what she alleged happened.
The fact that former Prince Andrew, who was accused by Virginia Giuffre, who claims she was sex trafficked by Epstein to former Prince Andrew, guess what? Former Prince Andrew entered into a settlement when legal suit was brought against him with Virginia Giuffre. What does that tell us about whether her claims were credible or not? Now, the monetary amount has not been disclosed, but still, that gives you a pretty clear data point about why he is now under investigation, although he's under investigation in the UK for potentially compromising governmental information as if sex trafficking wasn't bad enough. So the other thing that it looks like, it feels like Pam Bondi.
A settlement was reached. An undisclosed amount of money changed hands. That is the outcome of a legal system functioning at its most compromised. Not justice for a victim, but a transaction, a price paid to make a problem go away. And now, the British police are trying to go further than a civil settlement. They are trying to build something that cannot be settled, a criminal case, a prosecution, the kind of accountability that cannot be negotiated away with a wire transfer. And Washington is blocking them.
She's putting a stop to another country's law enforcement authorities to move forward in an investigation or a prosecution of significant wrongdoing. I mean, does it surprise anybody if this is the path Pam Bondi chooses? It doesn't surprise anybody, but we need to remain focused on what she's doing, why she's doing it, and what it represents, because accountability has to come, Brian, once we have a law-abiding president and a law-allegiant Department of Justice leadership.
What excuse would she have for denying a foreign government? And frankly, what excuse does she have for denying the U.S. government the other 3 million files? But what excuse could she possibly give that would justify her unwillingness to share these files with other, whatever their equivalents of the Department of Justice is, to hold?
The world is watching this unfold, not just the UK. Countries across the globe have looked at the minimal documents that Bondi has allowed to surface, cross-referenced them with what they know about their own citizens' connections to Epstein, and opened their own investigations. This is not an American story. It never was. Epstein's operation crossed borders, crossed oceans, crossed every line of power and privilege that was supposed to protect the most vulnerable. The cover-up is also crossing borders. The refusal to release those files is not just failing American victims, it is failing victims in countries that never consented to be part of this network's reach. It is failing law enforcement agencies and allied nations who are trying to do exactly what their job descriptions require. It is failing the most basic obligation of any government, to protect its people and to hold those who harm them accountable. Pam Bondi has been more than 3 months late in complying with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a federal law, not a suggestion, not a guideline, a law, and she has violated it openly, visibly, without apology or explanation. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. There is no ongoing prosecution to protect.
They're still investigating some of this stuff, but Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison, serving out a 20-year term. Jeffrey Epstein is dead, and as far as we have been told publicly, there is no other investigation. So there's no reason not to A, release the 3 million files that Pam Bondi now more than 3 months is late on, and also share any information with other foreign governments who are actually deigning to do their fucking jobs and hold some.
There is no legitimate procedural argument for continued concealment. There is only the political calculation of an administration that knows what is in those files and has decided that protecting its own interests matters more than providing the evidence that justice requires. That calculation has a cost, and the cost is being paid right now by women who cannot get justice, by foreign governments who cannot complete their investigations, by a world watching the most powerful law enforcement institution on earth act not as a guardian of justice, but as a shield for the powerful. This is not the end of this story, not even close. The Metropolitan Police are not going to stop. The legal mechanisms for international evidence sharing exist and will be activated. The political landscape will shift. Documents leak. Witnesses talk. Lawyers file motions. Time moves forward. And when it does, when the moment comes, as it always does, when concealment becomes impossible and the architecture of a cover-up finally collapses under its own weight, the question will not be what was in those files. The question will be who knew, who decided, who gave the order to hold the line, and who, at every stage of this process, made the choice that protecting powerful men from accountability was worth more than justice for the people they destroyed. Those names are going to matter. The files are not going anywhere, the investigations are not stopping, and the world is paying attention in a way that makes the old tricks, the quiet settlements, the palace statements, the legal delays, feel increasingly insufficient. So here is what I'm leaving you with. When a government possesses evidence of crimes against children and another government's law enforcement is actively trying to deliver justice to survivors, and the first government says no, not for legal reasons, not for procedural reasons, but because the evidence implicates people who are politically connected to those making the decision, what exactly is the difference between that government and the network it is supposed to be investigating? If this story deserves more eyes, share it right now. Subscribe to the Axiom Leaks, because the files on this are far, far from closed.